Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be talking to you this afternoon. And as you digest your lunch, you, unfortunately, have the somewhat dubious pleasure of listening to me, for which I apologise. What's worse is you remember Mitch Fox's notes from yesterday? There were 2 lines. Well, I've got a whole book here, so I hope you can stay awake for me. Thanks to ICAO for the opportunity to speak with you. I'm going to be talking to you about designing, evaluating, and improving language tests, a subject about which I'm passionate and which, for better or for worse, has occupied around 110% of my life for the last 4 years. And I'll be drawing on my experience of developing a test for flight crew and working with regulatory and test service providers around the world, helping them to improve their testing practices. I hope this presentation is useful for regulators developing their own tests or selecting third-party test providers to test on their behalf. And I also hope it's useful for any test provider considering applying for ICAO recognition in the future. So, there are 3 key stages to language testing. These are the design stage, the review stage, and the administration stages. And it is an iterative, cyclical process. It never stops, and it should never stop. As with all things in life, if we want quality, we have to work hard. And we have to have the courage to accept that there is room for improvement and the will to do something about it. And this is particularly true with high-stakes language proficiency testing for aviation. So let's have a look at the first stage in detail. Design. This is where you write your test specifications for the abilities you want to measure, otherwise known as the test construct. And you write your specifications for the tasks, the assessment, and the administration procedures. At the design stage, you address your key validity questions. For validity, by and large, resides in the test construct and in the test tasks. Then there is the pilot stage. This is when you try out the overall test and you decide, broadly speaking, if it works. Piloting then may result in going back to the drawing board and making some improvements to your design. Then there is the investigation stage, in which you trial your test and investigate more deeply how the test is functioning. And then finally, there is the report stage, in which you communicate to your stakeholders the work you have done. Now, it may be that after your trials, you may need to return once again to the drawing board to iron out any issues. Much better to feel confident that your test is working well at the beginning than it is to try and rectify mistakes further down the line. So let's have a look at these stages now in a little more detail. The first question we ask at the design stage is, who are we testing? Are we working with airline pilots? Are we working with commercial helicopter pilots? Are we working with approach radar controllers? Absolutely essential to define exactly who it is we are going to be testing. Then we need to consider whether our tasks together represent on-the-job language use, whether they represent the 6 criteria, of course you know them well: pronunciation, structure, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension, interactions. And of course, the 6 levels, 1 to 6, if indeed you want to test the 6 levels. And then we need to consider, how is the test assessed? Do you have separate listening and speaking components to the test? If so, how are they linked? How are the raters trained? What guidance material is given to the raters? So let's have a look at who we are testing, thinking about flight crew for a moment and thinking about the skills of speaking and listening. What does a pilot have to do every day he or she goes to work? Well, firstly, communicate with ground approach tower and en route air traffic controllers. Communicate with other flight crew, cabin crew and passengers. Communicate with maintenance personnel, operations and dispatch, tug drivers, de-icing crews, etc. And then at the end of a long sector, a long day's work, you've got to communicate with the taxi driver and get yourself booked into the hotel. And of course, as part of your on-the-job language use, pilots also have to communicate with simulator instructors and examiners. What's quite interesting today, and particularly now after 10 years of the introduction of the ICAO language proficiency requirements, is that part of on-the-job language use is now talking to language testers, which is quite strange, and which tells us as language testers that it is absolutely essential that rather than presenting artificial simulacrum of on-the-job language use, that our tasks represent as closely as possible what pilots and controllers do when they're communicating together on the radio. So looking then at on-the-job language use tasks, from which we could derive our test tasks, we also need to consider the ICAO criteria. And these two elements will inform the design of our test tasks. Let's think for a moment about subject matter knowledge and the extent to which subject matter knowledge interacts with language knowledge. We know we are not testing operational procedures, but we know we also need to test on-the-job language use. So, take an experienced airline pilot. Here's a scenario. Engine fire on takeoff. The aircraft is climbing to 5,000 feet. The pilot in command intends to return to the airfield, and the task is to dump fuel. Now, for an experienced professional, there is no question that the pilot will understand the procedures, the checklist items, and the safety implications related to this scenario, regardless of what first language they use. So the question then is whether they can do this in English. We can, as testers, assume, and we must assume, if we are dealing with licensed professionals, that subject matter knowledge is in place. Let's then turn to English language knowledge. We're going to listen to, very apt, as we are in Quebec, a French pilot talking to a native-speaking controller.
321 heavy, and will you be dumping fuel? 321 heavy, we will have, yes, maybe 3 minutes dumping.
Okay, do you want to do that over the ocean right now? That would be probably the best bet.
That is affirmative. I'll call you back when starting, if it is possible on that heading.
321 heavy, if it's possible, flying 180. I'll just keep you over the water while you do the dump.
Okay, maintain heading 180. Call you back ending dumping.
So there's a pilot doing it for real. What does this mean for test design? Assuming that subject matter knowledge is in place, that the test takers are licensed professionals, our job as testers is to engage this subject matter knowledge to allow the test takers to bring this subject matter knowledge to bear on language performance. We should not try and divorce one from the other. Rather, the two should interact in the performance of test tasks. In other words, in a test for flight crew or air traffic controllers, test tasks should engage subject matter knowledge and English language knowledge in order to give us an accessible snapshot of operational language proficiency. So then we turn to the scale, and our considerations here are twofold. Firstly, how do we define the descriptors in the context of our test takers? In the case of licensed pilots, what do we consider to be a wide variety of familiar and unfamiliar topics? What is an unfamiliar topic to a pilot? Likewise, fluency level 4, what do we mean by the transition from rehearsed or formulaic speech to spontaneous interaction? what does this mean in the context of radio communications with controllers? Comprehension of linguistic and cultural subtleties. What does that mean for an airline pilot flying internationally? And then sensitivity to non-verbal cues. If we want to use this scale and test across the criteria and across the levels, we need to know exactly what the scale means in the context of our test takers. Our second consideration with regard to the rating scale is that if we are assessing all 6 levels, we need to be sure that our test tasks give comprehensive coverage of the scale. Here's task 1, okay, and let's say this is a radio telephony role-play task. We may decide that this will allow us to test, say, up to level 4 across all criteria. It is clear then that what we will need is more tasks to engage the other abilities in the rating scale. For example, comprehension, we may design a task specifically to measure comprehension, levels 1 to 6, and then we may design a third task to measure the upper end language abilities at levels 5 and 6 across the 6 criteria. So we need to understand that it is impossible for one task to engage all the criteria at all the levels, and we will always need a range of carefully designed tasks, and we will need to know exactly what each task is designed to do with reference to the 6 levels and to the 6 criteria. Now we have our tasks, we can begin to pilot them. At this stage, we may wish to know whether the test works at a very broad level, and we are interested in these items. Do the rubrics or instructions work? Do the tasks themselves work? Does the timing work? Is it too long? Not long enough? Do the procedures work? And altogether, does the test flow? Is it a comfortable test instrument? Not necessarily comfortable from the point of view of the test taker, but does it flow from beginning to end? Does it make sense? Does it hang together? Now we have a test that we are satisfied flows, broadly speaking. We can now take the test to a full trial and investigate more deeply how the test is functioning. We will need to arrange for a much larger number of test takers to take the test, enough to generate a sufficient body of data to allow us to make some statistical inferences and to identify patterns in the test. And the questions we will need to ask are, firstly, how difficult are the tasks? Are the items or questions working well? Are the versions of the test equally difficult? Do the tasks and raters produce reliable scores? What do independent experts think? And very importantly, what do the candidates think? So we gather the data, we run our analyses, we look at the results, and we ask ourselves the crucial question: what improvements can we make? Then we report, and we create information for candidates so they can prepare to take the test and to know what to expect. We prepare information for other stakeholders: teachers, sponsors, recruiters, airlines, navigation service providers, training organizations, and critically, regulators. Then we provide evidence for test quality so we can demonstrate our commitment to safety. And then we communicate our plans for improvement so we can demonstrate our commitment to quality. Then, finally, we can begin testing. But our work doesn't stop there. Notice how this box is a dark blue at the top and then very light, even white at the bottom. It gets weaker as we use it, and this exactly will happen to our tests. The test will become well known quite quickly among the population of test takers. The pilots will meet in the ops room and say, "I got the engine fire scenario," or "I got the depressurization scenario." So we will need to keep our material fresh and at the same time, investigate whether the test is functioning as intended. So halfway, more or less, through our administration, we may wish to look at the following. Are the systems and procedures working well? Is the test producing consistent results? Is the test discriminating at the various levels? Are the versions equally difficult? And is the test biased towards one group or another? And as well as the test data themselves, who took the test, when, what scores they got, which raters produced those scores, which version of the test that candidates took, we will also need to gather feedback from the administrators, from the interlocutors, from the raters, and from the candidates. Then, on the basis of the data, we can review the test and the specifications and the materials and the procedures, and we can trial our improvements. If we adjust the timing of a task, if we modify the content of a listening text, if we alter the procedures for assessment and guidance to raters, what effect will this have? And again, we may want to, after investigation, return to the review phase so we can make those improvements. And once we are satisfied that our changes have led to meaningful, demonstrable improvements, then we can report to the community of users and to the stakeholders and roll out a second phase of administration. So far, we have sought to establish a test which is internally consistent, reliable, and valid. And we have done this at the design stage and again at the administration stages. And we have done this as an iterative process of review and administration. Now we are satisfied that we have an internally robust system in place. We can begin to explore the wider issues related to the way the test functions. These are: what cognitive processes do the candidates apply? When they are taking the test, what's going on in here? What cognitive processes do the raters apply? Are they all approaching the process in the same way, or are different people doing different things? What effect does the test have on language learning? There's our washback. Does the test produce scores consistent with other validated tests, or what is known as concurrent validity? And then finally, does the test predict on-the-job language performance? Now, this final question, what is known as predictive validity, is possibly the single most important question in language testing in any context, but especially with language testing for aviation. Essentially, the question is this: when we award a level 4 or above in a language test, does that pilot or controller then perform effectively and safely on the job? Clearly, this is a very difficult question to answer. If there is a non-routine situation, for example, who's to say that poor performance linguistically was not the result of workload, complexity of the problem, quality of CRM going on between the crew, or perhaps other factors such as fatigue or stress? Likewise, who would we ask about performance of pilots or controllers or other crew members? Would we ask ramp inspectors? Would we ask colleagues? Would we ask the controllers themselves? Would we ask simulator instructors? Do we ask about performance in non-routine situations only, or in all situations in which language is used on the radio? By now, understanding that we have a robust and reliable test, we can begin to use our test data as instruments of research. We can ask about the impact that our tests have on language learning, on language use, and ultimately on aviation safety. To conclude, the reasons that we must improve our tests is to improve validity. For without validity, our tests are meaningless. Hubley and Zumbo remind us that of all the concepts in testing, validity is the most basic and far-reaching, for without validity, a test and any inferences made from it are meaningless. And Alderson reminds us that validity is not a characteristic of a test, but a feature of the inferences made on the basis of test scores and the uses to which a test is put. So I'll leave you now with a couple of thoughts. The ICAO language proficiency requirements are 10 years old, and we have come a long way. There are dozens of tests in use around the world today. So in answer to our first question, does it fly? We can say, well, yes, it does. Pilots and controllers take tests. Licenses are validated. Here's the second question. Is it safe? And an answer in the affirmative to this question will depend on the extent to which test developers investigate how their tests work and improve their tests in earnest, and the extent to which regulators insist on the very highest standards in test quality and therefore help regulate a safe aviation industry. Thank you very much.